I cannot, is anybody?
No.
I've never heard of such a Ophelia. Ira. A lot to pray for. I mean, I sometimes when I was in college, I think it was about a sophomore. I was sitting in a class. I don't remember what class it was. And I was thinking, well, shoot, the Vietnam War's over and civil rights is pretty well underway. I thought, here I am, young, energetic, want to change the world, and there's nothing to do. Yeah, right. Okay, David, what I want to do today is we're looking at the period in which David, after all this, actually consolidates power as king over the 12 tribes of Israel. And you'd think that would be the major emphasis of the Bible when it comes to his career. But after all of these, First Samuel being about his early period, 2 Samuel devotes only about 6 chapters to David's actually consolidating power. And we're going to look at that and take this opportunity because I've been cramming stuff in so much. We're going to look at that pretty quickly and then take the rest of the class time to catch up on our thoughts and questions from what we've been studying so far. Before we go into what is the last, and I think probably most, puzzling to me, period in David's life, his so-called mature reign. Let me talk about that so that we can bracket it off from what we're going to do now for just a second, anticipatorily, right? Scholars of the Deuteronomistic history of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, for some time now, have speculated is not quite right, conjectured is not quite, hypothesized, that's right, a little more than a conjecture, that the the material that deals with the last period in David's life had an independent existence before it was incorporated into the books we have now. You understand what I mean? It circulated as a document of its own for a while. And we have given it the nickname, the succession narrative, because it deals with the question, I mean, think about it. Israel, by the time you come toward the end of David's life, Israel has had 2 kings. Both of them not related to each other, at least not initially. David became a son-in-law, but not when he was just a boy when he was anointed. So the question now arises sometime in David's life, are we going to have this sort of turmoil and controversy and unease and chaos in the transition to the 3rd king? Is there some prophet out there in the countryside somewhere anointing some shepherd boy that's going to look like David did, and we're going to have this, mess that we've had with Saul and David? Or is there going to be some other way? Well, the answer comes rather quickly in 2 Samuel chapter 7, in what's called the promise of Nathan, when Nathan says to David on God's behalf that no, from now on there will be a dynasty. In other words, the next king will be your son, and the king after that will be his son, and the king after that his, and so on and so forth. And in fact, the kingdom divides into north and south, but in the south, in Jerusalem, over Judah, until 586, when Nebuchadnezzar closes down the Shah. The kings in Israel have all been descendants of David, will have all been descendants of David. But then that raises also the question, okay, which of your sons, the oldest, the next? And we begin already in, I think it begins in 2nd Samuel chapter 6, but certainly by chapter 10 and 11, we are fully into the succession narrative. Now, I'm one of the few that thinks that the succession narrative was sort of broken apart a little bit and woven into the other material. So rather than having one point at which it starts, I think there's a little bit of it that bleeds over. So we're going to be looking at the parts that I think aren't succession narrative, right, left in 2 Samuel. And next week, we'll deal with all that question of who will come after David, which turns out to take all the way into 1 Kings. It's a long, long story, and not a very pleasant one. But let's look at David's consolidation of power. Now let's remember where he is at this point. By the end of 1 Samuel, Saul and Jonathan have gone into battle against the Philistines. Jonathan's killed, Saul is mortally wounded, and rather than be taken captive by the Philistines and be subjected to the kind of torture and humiliation that would have come, he commits suicide on the battlefield. Word of that comes to David, and in 2 Samuel 1, we have that story of David receiving that word, and then his lament over Saul and Jonathan. How the mighty have fallen is the refrain. He praises Saul for his valor in battle, and he praises Jonathan a lot because they were such good friends. Now, we're in 2 Samuel chapter 2, and we get down to business. Remember that David has been anointed. Everybody knows who David is because of his exploits over time. But as of now, he owns, because the Philistine king Achish gave it to him, he owns the little village of Ziklag, right on the border between Judah and Philistia. It's his outright property. And he has a personal army of these 600 or so ragamuffins, vagabonds, who've been hanging out with outlaws, who've been hanging out with him and helping him extort people as necessary to stay alive. And now I'm going to read a lot more of the Bible than I usually read because it's important to hear this. After this, I'm in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 1. After this, that's his song of lament over Jonathan and Saul. David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah?" The Lord said to him, "Go up." Now this inquire of the Lord, by the way, is a technical term in the Old Testament. That means that David probably, if you wanted an answer from God, you had two clear courses of action. You could go to a priest, and they kept in the pocket of their ephod, I love that word, two rocks called the Urim and the Thummim, right? Probably yes and no. We don't know how the Bible ever tells us. They must have been the same shape and size and so forth, or else you could feel in your pocket to reach around and get the ones you wanted. But apparently they were, black and white or red and green or, I don't know what. And you'd go to, so you could ask a yes-no question of God. And this seems to be a yes-no question. Shall I go up? And you go to a priest and say, ask God if I should go up into Judah. And the priest says, should he go up into Judah? Reaches in and pulls out a rock. Oh, it's green. Go. Right? The other way was to go to a prophet. That's if it wasn't a yes-no question. What should I do? Yes. That doesn't work. You need something else. And then you would go to a prophet, as Saul did to Samuel when he was trying to find his daddy's lost donkeys, remember. And a prophet could give you more than a yes-no answer. But here we have, shall I go up? Yes. To which shall I go up? Hebron. Now, in these days, Hebron, which is, if you think of a map of Israel, the north of the Dead Sea, if you draw a line straight across, that's more or less, Israel is north and Judah is south in the divided monarchy here. If you go down to the bottom of the Dead Sea and draw a line across, that's in the biblical days, habitable part of Judah. South of that is the desert. There are people down there, but you can't have a city there. Almost midways is Hebron. Okay? It was associated with Abraham. It was a cultic center. You could think of it as the capital city of the tribe of Judah. Right? So God says to David, go to Hebron, the capital city of the tribe of Judah. So David went up there along with his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David brought up the men who were with him, everyone with his household, and they settled in the towns surrounding Hebron. Now the next verse. Then the people of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. Now do you get this picture? David went to the capital city of Judah and settled his army all around it. And then the people of Judah said, hey, I know what. We're going to make you king. And David said, how did you come by that idea? Immediately, when they told David it was the people of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul after he died, David sent messengers there to Jabesh Gilead. It's a city in the north, also kind of a capital. And this was his message. May you be blessed by the Lord because you have showed this loyalty to Saul your Lord and buried him. Now may the Lord show steadfast love and faithful to this to you. And I too will reward you because you have done this thing. Therefore let your hands be strong and be valiant. For Saul your Lord is dead. And this is the last thing in the message. And the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. Saul's dead. Judah has made me king down here. What's y'all going to do? Any ideas? Yeah, it doesn't work out though. It turns out, and I'm going to skip a bunch of stuff now, we'll come back to the Bible in a minute. It turns out that Saul had a surviving son. His name was Ishbaal. Now that's a problem. If you know anything, Hebrew names, Semitic names in general, typically have what's called a theophoric element. One part of the name will be the name of a god, right? So, let me see if I can. Samuel, the generic word in Semitic languages for God is El or Al. Samuel's name means God hears, right? Daniel's name means God, El, is my judge, right? Or it will have a form of God's proper name. That will be Yah or Yahoo. So, Isaiah in Hebrew is Yeshua Yahu, right? Which means the Lord saves, and so on. Jonathan, Yah Nathan, a gift of the Lord, right? Ishbaal, what theophoric element do you hear in that name? Baal. Whoa. His name means a man of Baal, Baal's man. Later scribes, first in the Deuteronomic history, he's called Ishbaal. In later literature, he's called Ishbosheth. The scribes substituted Bosheth, which in Hebrew means shame, for the name Baal. So he's not a man of Baal, he's a man of shame. Anyway, Abner, one of Saul's generals, has established Ishbaal as the king of the northern tribes, right? And Ishbaal turns out not to be a very competent king, but anyhow. And so there's a period of time, we don't know how long because the chronology here is all messed up. There's a period of time, we could speculate 3, 5, 7 years, in which you have the king Ishbaal in the north and David in the south, and they actually fight some border skirmishes. To jump all the way forward, David's cousin and general is a man named Joab. In the ancient Near East, one of the ways you laid your claim to being king was by, and remember this for next Sunday, was by taking possession of the harem of the last king. Okay? Saul, it turns out, had a concubine. Abner took her as his wife. Ishbaal interpreted that as an act of rebellion. Are you following this? And he upbraided Abner about it severely. And Abner said, look, you wouldn't be in power if I weren't supporting you because you're weak and I'm not. And he said, I'll be dogged, literally. I'll be a dog's head for Judah, he said. We don't know what that means, except that I think it means I'll be dogged. If I let this stand, I am going to deliver your kingdom into the hand of thee. And Abner goes south and begins negotiations. Joab, David's cousin and general, realizes that if Abner, Ishbaal's general, is able to do this, then David will owe Abner, and that will mean that rather than Joab being Secretary of Defense, Abner will be Secretary of Defense. And so Joab finds some pretense and assassinates Abner. David says, shame on you. This begins a pattern, by the way. if you see, in this story, from now on, if you see Joab coming, run. Because you're about to, it's not going to turn out well for you. He is David's hitman. And David always says, oh, I wish you hadn't done that. Don't do that again. Right? So now, word of this gets back to Ishbaal in the north, and two of his sons of Baanah, two of his captains, sneak into his bedroom at night, and assassinate him, and bring his head to David as a gift. Now, David doesn't like this assassinating stuff. He wouldn't assassinate Saul. I think David is well aware that if he condones the idea of assassinating a king,
Yeah.
You're a king, yeah.
and so they think they're going to be, lauded and promoted. Does not work out that way. He has them executed. He says, you kill a good man in his bed. David's idea seems to be, I'll take him on in a fair fight, but this sneaking up and killing him in his bed is yellow bellied, right? Not noble.
Well, David really objected when they killed Absalom.
Yes.
Yes.
Who killed Absalom? You know? Joab. I mean, who else?
Oh.
And he said to Joab, I really wish you hadn't
Wish you
done that.
hadn't. Sounds like Thomas the Bacon.
Who does Joab? Well, let's see. I don't even think I can name everybody Joab assassinates for David. Sometimes David asks him to, as in Bathsheba's husband, Uriah.
Yeah.
Sometimes Joab just sort of realizes that David would be better off if this guy was out of the way. Right? And so without being asked, he just does it. And then always David says, oh.
Oh.
Give me your hand. Don't you do that. Assassinating people that way. They're very ugly. Let me find, I should have turned the page already. Here we go. This is after Ishbaal has been assassinated and David has executed the assassins. Shame on them. Chapter 5. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, look, we're your bone and flesh of your flesh. For some time while Saul was king over us, it was you who led out Israel and brought it in. The Lord said to you, it is you who shall be shepherd of my people. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord. And they anointed David king over Israel. Now let's pause here. There are two things that are very significant about this. We know, just from the language and other things, that north and south, I mean, it's like Israel, greater Israel was like the United States in this regard. Northern culture and southern culture weren't the same. They all spoke Hebrew, but there were dialects. You know that story about Shibboleth, don't you, in Judges, where they're able to catch some northerners trying to infiltrate the south because they asked them to say Shibboleth. And in the north, they don't have a sh sound. And they said Sibboleth. And they said, ah, gotcha, Yankee. You Yankee? What are you doing down here? Right? And so we know that there were significant cultural differences. And here, when David becomes king of Judah, his own people, he's a Judean, they just anoint him king. What do the Israelites do? They negotiate with him a covenant, which means that there are terms and conditions for their relationship with David. We don't know what they are, but this becomes important later when, after Solomon dies, Rehoboam, his son, expects the northern tribes to just anoint him king too, and they say, no, we want to revisit this covenant that we have with your family, because we don't think you're quite living it up to it. And he says, covenant, I'm the king, and you're going to do what I tell you. And they say, all right, fine. And withdraw and anoint somebody else, Jeroboam the first, and then begins to divide. We'll come to that later. But here we have the beginnings of what people have referred to as, people describe David's kingdom / empire as being operating on the basis of what we call a personal union. And already it's begun. Let's trace, in other words, the northern tribes and the southern tribes aren't constitutionally united here, right? It's like in British history, James I and James VI, one of Scotland and one of England, are the same person. And then you have the United Monarchy. But the union of the monarchy, the United Kingdom, was unified in the fact that one person happened to have inherited both thrones at the same time, right? So let's review. David owns Ziklag personally, outright, okay? The Southerners have anointed him as king. The Northerners have negotiated a limited relationship with him. He will go on, and we won't have to read these passages, I'll just tell you about them. He will go on and conquer Jerusalem. David now has a problem, by the way. He's a Southerner. There's this north-south division in culture and in loyalties. He needs to start unifying. And how will he do that? Well, one way to do it would be to have a capital. They don't have a capital city. Saul never had a capital city. Where are you going to put it? In the north or in the south? Well, if he puts it in the north, his southerners will say, oh, see there, he's sold out. If he puts it in the south, the northerners will say, see there, he's not really our king, he's a southerner. What did we do in America back in the colonial days? We put it smack on the border. Jerusalem is smack on the border. It was a Jebusite city at the time. David takes his personal army, and this is important, and conquers Jerusalem and makes it his capital city. Now, he took his personal army. From now on, Jerusalem, whenever we don't read about Judah, and we read about Judah and Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is known as the city. Was he born there? No. When we read about Jerusalem as the city of David, we mean that Jerusalem belongs personally to the throne. It is not, it's a federal district. It is not part of Judah. Right? David conquered it not with the army of Israel, not with the army of Judah, but with his personal army. It belongs to him. Right? And then there are all these other conquests. He ends up defeating the Philistines finally, so they quit being a problem. He conquers Ammon, Moab, and Edom in the Transjordan, and Syria, and makes them all part of a sort of an empire. But they all owe their allegiance. They don't suddenly become Israelites. Say, oh, goody goody. We always wanted to be Israelite. No, they are conquered territory, right? And the thing that unifies all of this grand thing is David's personhood, the person of David. Right? Now we'll jump ahead under Solomon, by the way, almost in reverse order. Everything that David acquires peels off from Solomon because he's not able, by the strength and force of his personality, to keep it together, such that by the time we come to Rehoboam, he is left with Judah and Jerusalem, and maybe Ziklag, where David started. So David conquers Jerusalem as his personal and establishes there a capital city and builds a palace for himself, a very nice one. The Bible says, and then he marries a bunch more wives and has a bunch more children. I'm going to turn to this passage because this is interesting. Let's see.
So many wives, they don't count them?
Can't count them. Well, here, let me just read you this passage. This is 2 Samuel chapter 5, beginning of verse 9. David occupied the stronghold and named it the city of David. David built the city all around from the Milo inward, and David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of his hosts, was with him. King Hiram of Tyre sent messengers to David, along with cedar trees, and carpenters and masons who built David a house. David then perceived that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. In Jerusalem, after he came from Hebron, David took more concubines and wives, and more sons and daughters were born to him. Don't even bother to name them. Just more. Right? More's better.
Good to be king.
Good to be king. It does name his son, or some of them. Shemua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet. And Adonijah and Absalom aren't mentioned, but you get the idea. He had, a bunch of sons. And we don't know how many wives and concubines. Okay. So David has established his capital city in Jerusalem. What's another step he can take to sort of unify? If the capital is in Jerusalem, what else might he put there to unify things? Anybody have an idea?
Temple.
A temple. Except he doesn't do that yet. He brings the Ark of the Covenant there. Right. And you know that story. They have this great processional, and on the way, a couple of people, the ark starts to topple, and the fellow reaches up, and then David says, stop the processional. I forgot to ask God if this was a good idea. And somebody has just died. If this is something God doesn't want us to do, I don't want to bring the ark into Jerusalem, and then we're in trouble. So he goes to Obed-Edom, a fella, and he says, who lives thereby, and he says, I don't know if it's a good idea. Can we leave the ark at your house a while and see if anybody dies? And Obed-Edom says, okay. And the Bible says, and Obed-Edom flourished because, and then David says, okay, good. And by the way, this is already, I think, part of the succession narrative. And so the story of how David actually brings the ark into the city of Jerusalem, I think is already answering the succession questions. So I'm going to cheat and go ahead and talk about it, but it really is a success. Who would, if somebody's going to have a claim to be the next king of Israel, who would have a better claim than the grandson on his mother's side of the first king and the son of the second king, his father? Nobody would have a better claim. Who would that be? That would be Michal's son, right? We've been told already that David is sent to have her. He had been considered missing in action, and she'd been married off to some other fellow. David said, I got to have her back. I want her back. That was a condition he had for the northern kingdom when they made him king, and they said, send her back. I want to read this story because I think it's funny. It's hilarious to me. So let's see. I'm reading in 2 Samuel 6, verse 20. David returned to bless his... No. I got to read now before that. Verse 16. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord. And she despised him in her heart. Why? Well, as we'll see later, he was probably dressed in his military dress uniform, which would have included an ephod. Now, an ephod, I've already used that word before, is, you can think of it as a mini skirt. And he was leaping and dancing before the Lord. And this was the day before Fruit of the Loom had gone into business. Now, and she looked out and she said, look, now let's see how, whether, that's what we'll hypothesize. Let's see if the evidence later on gives it. Verse 20, David returned to bless his household, but Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David, and she said, good Lord, how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants' maids, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover. She said, Harvey Weinstein. David. Now notice David's response. It was before the Lord who chose me in place of your father and all his household to appoint me as prince over Israel. People, I have danced before the Lord. Oh, and by the way, I will make myself yet more contemptible in this, and I will be abased in my own eyes. Oh, and by the way, but the maids of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. Someone translate that, paraphrase that for me. They didn't seem to mind. Now, the last verse is what I think makes this part of the succession narrative. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. So, what we're going to do next week is start putting up a list of, oh, this is a good candidate for king after David. No, it's not. The best candidate would have been Michal's son, right? 7. She was never born. After this episode, Michal and David had a falling out, right? And that was the end of that relationship, pretty much. Although you can imagine she lived at the far end of the palace all by herself for the rest of her life. Isn't that interesting? Oh, by the way, I tell my students that I'm in favor of praising the Lord with whatever means you can, and especially aesthetically. And there is the liturgical dance movement, and they always appeal to this text. I always say to my students, liturgical dance is a wonderful idea. However, do not base it on this passage. And do not emulate David's worship of the Lord at First Presbyterian Church on Sunday morning. It will not work. Now, chapter 7 is also a succession. Let's skip to chapter 8, and it's the last chapter. How many there have been? Only about 4 that deal with David's consolidation of power. And here he does things. By the way, I wonder if you've noticed, we said when we started this study that this is history, but it's not history in the way other history is history. Have we heard anything about the economy? Have we heard anything about how the people are doing or what their attitudes are? Do we know anything about anybody except David and Saul and these close right there at the top of leadership? What's going on here? We know nothing about whether the people are worshiping the Lord faithfully and honestly, whether they're having good crops, whether they're having good relations with their... We know nothing about that because this is not history in that sense. This is closer to theological biography, isn't it, than anything else. We're interested in only really one person so far, and that is David, and anybody who happens to be in his immediate orbit, but David, right? This is not history in the normal sense. And we are reading about David, who is a gigantic figure, obviously, in Israelite history. Are we reading a hagiography? Do you know that term? It was popular in the early church to write lives of the saints. And when you wrote a life of the saint, he was just always, float off the ground about 6 inches, and always like this, and a halo of bestowing blessing everywhere. But is this a hagiography? Is this cleansing David's record and making him seem bigger and better than he was? Or is it, what do you think about it? Was he a power player, power politician? They've anointed me, what do you think you ought to do? They move in with the National Guard all around Hebron and say, I'm available if you want to make a king. Otherwise, I've got this army, I might need something to do. Might have to think of something to do with it, What do you think of it? Yes.
Without a temple, what do we know about how Jews actually worship?
That they would have done when he brought the ark, he would have brought the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, with it. Right? And so it had been itinerant all over Israel at that time, and he brought it and made it stationary. Matter of fact, there's some feeling, and this is if you want to start a fight. It's very arcane, but if you want to start a fight amongst Old Testament professors, say, I believe that David built the temple around the tabernacle. And then the room will do this, and it'd be worse than anything you could see in Washington. But Leviticus 18:12, I don't care about Leviticus 18:12, 2 Samuel 35, and then, oh boy, here we go. I'm going to read just this last part because this is the part that's most nearly like secular history in the whole story. Sometime afterward, David attacked the Philistines and subdued them. He also defeated the Moabites and the Moabites became servants to David. David also struck down King Hadadezer, son of Rehoboam of Zobah. David, let's see. When the Arameans of Damascus came to help King Hadadezer of Zobah, David defeated them. David put garrisons among the Arameans. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. When King Toy of Hamath heard that David had defeated the whole army of Hadadezer, he sent his son to say, "Don't fight me, I'll be your ally." Right? I'm paraphrasing. Verse 13, David won a name for himself, so on and so forth, put garrisons in Edom. Verse 15, so David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was recorder, secretary of state. Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, were priests. Sariah was secretary. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Cherethites and the Pelethites, whoever they were. We're not sure. Maybe a bodyguard, but we're not sure. And David's sons were priests. That sounds like sort of a summary statement of how he established a real government, doesn't it? And that's the last thing. Now we're off into the succession narrative, full bore. Right? The only part that sounds like sort of a secular history. By the way, should David's sons have been priests? No.
They weren't Levites.
They were not Levites. By the way, this is one of my favorite passages to rail against Bible translations. If you're looking at a new translation, pick it up and see how it translates this verse. It's the last verse in 2 Samuel chapter 8. Because either you translate what the Hebrew says, and it says Kohanim, which means priests, or the translators think, well, David's sons weren't supposed to be priests, and David was David, so he wouldn't have done anything wrong. He wouldn't have done anything wrong. So this word priests here must not mean priest here. It must mean something else. Right? Do you follow that line of thinking? That's not translating. That's doing mental gymnastics to protect the image of a man whose image doesn't need being protected. And if the translators will do that, you can't trust them anywhere else. Yes. Yes. NIV, by the way, in case you're wondering.
I'm not real sure what the job description is for priest.
First of all, it's being a descendant of Levi.
Yeah.
But were some of them not acting as judges?
No, not much. Yeah.
Didn't they bring disputes before the priest?
Yeah, if it had to do with an interpretation of Torah.
Oh.
Yeah,
So how do the
yeah. Administrators.
Royal advisors in this.
Huh?
Royal advisors.
Advisors. What translation do you have?
NIV.
Oh, NIV. Royal advisors. Yeah. Anyway, the rest of the story of David is the succession narrative, and we'll deal with that next week. I'm curious. We didn't have time for questions last time. We've covered a good bit of David's life. What are you thinking?
I was just curious, if Ishmael
Right.
was a son of Baal?
Man of
Baal. What does Ishmael mean?
Huh?
You know, Ishmael. The name-
Ishmael. Oh, that's different. The Lord has heard.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
the Lord has heard. Next, other questions?
I have one.
Yes, or comments?
To me, it's helpful to know sort of the geographic boundaries of all these things.
Right,
So when Israel came together with that covenant,
right.
what was Israel, and then what was the conquered territories of David?
Okay, let's do the modern map. Can you keep the modern map in your mind? All right. Judah will have been that part I talked about, that center part south of. If you think of the Dead Sea, the land mass between it and the Mediterranean, north and south, that's Judah. North of there to what is now the Golan Heights, was Israel. the northern border, well, it's pretty much what it is now. The northern border will have been what we think of as Lebanon. Well, the Gaza Strip were the Philistines, more or less. Now let's go to the Transjordan. Right? The modern kingdom of the modern kingdom of Jordan corresponds to. I always think it's easy to remember north to south because then it's in alphabetical. No, it's not. Then it spells a word. Ammon, Moab, Edom. Edom is basically a little bit south. Here's Judah, a little bit south. Moab, Ammon. Okay. Up north of Ammon was Syria, also today, Syria. Lebanon. So that's we're talking. David's when he got finished at the largest extent, his empire covered basically modern day Israel, Jordan, and parts of modern day Syria, and parts of modern day Lebanon. The southern part. Yes.
Were the Philistines Semitic people?
No, they were not. They spoke a Semitic language, but they were Greeks.
No.
Yeah. There's this wonder. This was used to be. This is one of the what would you call it? One of the breakthroughs of archaeology about 30 or 40 years ago, which is now standardized. We know the following. We know that the Trojan Wars took place somewhere in the
1250.
Yes. We know that the ancient Hittite Empire fell around 1250. We know that Ras Shamra, Ugarit, in modern day Lebanon, was conquered around 1250. We know that, judging from the archaeology of the kind of vessels they used, that the Philistines arrived around 1250. And the Egyptians repelled what they called the Sea Peoples around 1250. Oh, I forgot Crete. You know, Leonard Minoan A and Leonard Minoan B, the shift was around 1250. And Linear Minoan B turns out to be nothing other than
Early Greek.
Yeah. So this is what we think. Here's Greece. The area I just described is a big circle around the Mediterranean. Something upset Greece such that people were getting out of there. Right. Either they were aggressively expanding, or there had been a series of famines or wars or something. But the huge populations from Greece were fleeing to the east and being successful in toppling existing empires, except for the Egyptians were able to repel, but nobody else. The Philistines were part of that mass migration of sea peoples, as we call them, who came to Philistine. Now, once they got in Palestine, they adopted a Semitic language, a dialect of Canaanite, but their practices and their pottery, their clothing, all of those things were Greek.
That is fascinating.
Were the Phoenicians and the Philistines the same?
No. The Phoenicians, well, no, yes and no. The Phoenicians were part of that Sea Peoples migration, but they became Phoenician when they landed in Phoenicia, and their history then went a separate way. Other questions? Like, yes?
Is there a record of David in other
No.
cultures?
No. We have some seals on some, oh shoot, I'll have problems now.
Cylinders.
Cylinder seals, yeah. Okay, I read about this stuff in German, and so now I'm trying to think what the English word for these things. Well, we have some of these large. What do we call them? A jar is not right. They're bigger. You know, a jar is this. What
Crater.
Huh?
A crater. But that's great.
Container.
Yeah, a large containers for olive oil and wine, and they say Le David, to David or for David, but these things are dated 200 and 300 years after David would have been alive, which means that we believe, and by the way, if you were a descendant of David, you were on the throne. We think David became another word for king in the Davidic line, right? Do you understand what I'm saying? Which means, by the way, that some of the Psalms which say Le David, for David, and as scholars we can date the language to well after David, means that some of what we think of as Davidic Psalms are Davidic in the sense that they are for or about the king, but the king at the time is a descendant of David and not David himself. Does everybody follow what I just said?
Sort of like Caesar.
Sort of like, very much like Caesar. Yeah. Yes.
You described David today, and we're left with the assumption that he's evil and a manipulative person.
He is evil and a manipulative person.
But I'm thinking of the verse that said that.
A man after God's own heart.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a test question. That's been a test question in my Old Testament class for 20-something years.
Well, how do you,
That's the test question. That's exactly the test question.
She wants to know the answer.
I haven't had a satisfactory answer on a test to that question yet.
so how would you answer it?
Huh?
How would you?
He's waiting for a good answer.
I mean, yeah. I'm hoping one of my students one day will give me a good answer because I don't have one. The only thing I can think of is that when David is called to account, he's always quick to say, "Oh dear." He repents easily and quickly. And so there is something about the man. Well, last week, remember, I emphasized how naive he was in his earliest period. And then there came that fugitive period, which seems to have had some kind of negative impact on his person. And we've seen that he did learn in that time to use power pretty ruthlessly, didn't he? And we're going to see in the end, by the way, I would characterize him in the last period in his life as naive again. We'll see how that works out. One thing for sure, the Bible makes it clear that to be a man after God's own heart, whatever that means, does not mean the kind of sainthood that we have sometimes associated with Paul and John and David and Abraham and the like.
But even those, none of the men that God really called were saints.
No, I mean,
From the very beginning.
that is I think one of the most important points about reading these stories. Not the most, but one of the most important. Because many of us, well, I know early in my life when I felt God calling me, I thought, no, that can't possibly be true. I pretty, at that point in my life, I was pretty impious, actually. I went to church because my parents took me, but I didn't care about it too often. I didn't know the Bible at all. I wasn't sure about, why I was Baptist or whether I was Baptist. And on like that. So I thought, well, if God's calling me, he's really scraping the bottom of the barrel. There must not be much available, You can find somebody. You call a preacher's son. He knows it all. And by the way, he did call a preacher's son. We went to seminary together. But that we can't make these excuses for ourselves. I mean, we cannot say, I cannot do great things for God because I am not Abraham, or I am not David, or I am not Paul. Yeah, you are. Yeah, you are. Yeah. Yeah, you are.
Don't you think it has something to do with the fear of God?
You mean that David, a man after God's heart? Well, I mean, here's the deal. You have that statement. You have the story of David. The Bible nowhere helps you put those two together by saying, when we say that David is a man after God's own heart, we mean that this is true. You have to, it's like saying, I'll tell you the story of the life of Babe Ruth, and then I'll say, and he exemplified American, name something positive. And you're gonna have to figure out how I meant that, because I'm not gonna tell you, I don't tell you. There was a question over this one.
Well, it's maybe just overstating the obvious,
Yeah.
but he was successful. And
In the sense that he did it all, he didn't give it firm foundations.
could that have been one of God's passions, is to bring
Well, I mean,
this country together?
It could have been, but I just read you how it says he conquered and conquered and conquered. The Bible doesn't say God told David to go conquer Moab. David did that because David wanted to. The Bible doesn't say that God wanted. God said, now, this is the program. And one of the things that's clear, and it becomes clear already in Solomon, is that David built this empire, but he didn't use very good mortar. Because it starts crumbling almost the day he dies. And by the time his own son's life is over, Judah, Jerusalem. Other questions or comments? I mean, I want to think about, all right, this is in our Bible, and it's saying, it's because we consider it canonical scripture, it's saying something to us. What is it saying to us today? What does it, beside the fact that you don't have to, anybody can be David. I mean, God can call even me. I know the Bible now, and I know why I'm Baptist and all that sort of stuff, but I didn't at the time I was called, or felt called.
Because if all of the examples were perfect, we wouldn't feel like we could ever live up to it.
That's one. But this also the story I'll remind us of God's interaction in history at the level of a kingdom and kingdoms, internationally, right? What are we learning from this? Sometimes the learnings will be negative, by the way. What have you noticed and not noticed about, say, God's involvement in David's life, or God's explicit direction of David?
He
What have
doesn't
you-
always do what we think he ought to do.
David doesn't. Yeah, for sure.
Well, even God does.
Well, I'm wondering how often have I talked about God said do this, God said do that in David's life? How often have I read that? Not very often. Not very often at all. We read, and God was with David. We read that a lot, right? But we don't read God saying, now go do this, David.
Is this not the fulfillment, though, of Moses' dream?
No, not the fulfillment. I mean, remember that Samuel didn't want them to have a king. And God reminded them, yeah, this is a bad idea. God agreed with Samuel, yes, this is a bad idea. So one of the things we can say right now, if we're just taking the Bible at face value, you could argue that after Saul was anointed king, that the rest of the story is to illustrate that monarchies don't work well.
Maybe
Monarchies are not a good idea, yeah.
maybe the winners write the history.
There is that too.
Just the fact.
Well, that's one of the questions that intrigues me. If David is such a heroic figure in Israelite thinking, such that Messiah becomes the thing we all hope for, right? Who tells the story of David this way and why? Because this is almost like opposition research in modern political life. If you were running against David for Attorney General, this would be the story you'd tell, isn't it? Right?
It's an expose.
It sounds almost like one. Why would you do that? And when would you do that? Now I'll remind us that this was written just into the exilic period, right? There is no king in Israel, in Judah, Jerusalem anymore. And there are those who are looking to see the kingdom restored. I am wondering, and this is just a wonder, right? Was this written at a time to remind everybody, you want David back? Are you sure you want David back? I can think of another real good explanation for it.
Campaign to end the monarchy.
It's already done in, and it's a campaign to say, let's not be getting it back.
Let's not get it back.
Yeah, let's not get it back. We know from other literature in the Bible, especially 1st and 2nd Chronicles, that the priests in Judah at the time, and this is the exilic period, right? They were on a campaign to build a theocracy. They wanted to go back to the old days when there was no king, and theoretically God was in direct rule. Now, you can't have God in direct rule. Somebody has to be God's spokesman, right? And the priest argued, what?
It's me.
It's me.
We're here to be God's spokesman, right? We're priests after all. What else shall we do? Ezra, do you remember him? Came back and was tasked by the Persian emperor with running the show back in Jerusalem, and he was a
Prophet. A judge. Oh, yeah.
he was a priest.
Praise.
Right. So we think there may have been a little bit of that. The priest saying, don't need a king, we're here. Samuel said that didn't need a king. God told Samuel that Israel was rejecting his kingship. They weren't rejecting, So there was that argument. We know that well before Jesus' day, however, the notion that no, we need Messiah, the world needs Messiah, had persisted. I think, and here I'm leaving my PhD behind, delving into areas I've studied peripherally, but I think that Jesus' unease with the title Messiah had to do with his awareness that monarchy is not the answer. First, we've got to change people, right? And then God's kingdom in eternity, yeah, but the need right now is not for a king and not an army and not throwing the Romans out. It's for throwing sin out of people's hearts. And you understand what I'm saying? And you don't do that by divine decree. You do that by, sacrificial death. Yes?
Who said that Jesus was descended from David?
Matthew.
But so Jesus never said it.
Jesus never said it himself, no. Matthew and Luke both say it.
But they were familiar with the Old Testament. They must have revered David.
Yeah, but let's remind ourselves, in Jesus' day, how many Jews walking the roads of Jerusalem were descended from David?
How many wives did you say?
Every fourth one. Yeah, exactly. Every fourth person.
He had a lot of children.
He had a lot of children. Yeah. And there were a lot of generations in between. That's the thing, if you've ever done genealogy, you identify, I identified some time ago a great, 12 or 13 times great-grandfather who was of some minor historical importance. And there's a family association of people who descend from him, right? That's 13 or 14 generations ago. And the people who've identified themselves as members and been certified as, just the ones who identified themselves, number about 25,000. Right? And I'm not a member because I haven't been interested in that sort of thing. But I wonder how many, if all of us, my children aren't members.
So
Good Lord. Yeah.
Instead of making Jesus special and unusual, then they were making him one of the people.
No, not everybody was descended from
Right.
David. But he was one of several thousands anyway who played that role. And both Matthew and Luke make it clear. But see, Joseph was descended from David. Jesus' brothers were descended from David. Right? So, that claim is important, but help me here, somebody. It's
The genealogy.
I'm descended from David too, right? I'm the Messiah. No, I'm descended from David. I'm the Messiah, right?
Would the point be less that makes him special, or the point more that he had to be descended from David? So here is a piece of information, by the way, he has to be descended
That's
from
right.
David, and he is.
That's
a
exactly.
good point.
That's
I think it might be a more peripheral statement, it's just something that's
by the
this
way,
has to
The
happen.
prophecy has been fulfilled.
I think that's the way to look at it.
That's
the
thank
way to
you.
look at it. The question for Jesus was, what was Messiahship going to mean in his life? And by the way, you know all those times, I sense we're out of time. But let me say this thing and then we'll go. You know that famous episode at Caesarea Philippi when Jesus said, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter said, "You're the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus said, "Well, good for you, you figured that out. Now I'm going to suffer and die." And Peter said, "No, you're not. That's not possible. I just told you you were king, right? And now you're telling me you're going to be rejected and die? That's not what kings do. Kings don't come to die; they come to rule." And David said, and Jesus in effect said, "Get behind me, Satan." So I think that Jesus faced the temptation his whole life. It begins that way with the wilderness temptation of exercising his Christhood, his messiahship, before he exercised his servanthood.
That is a fascinating book.
You should write this.
All right, I'll see you next.